And I looked up and there was a man struggling with a flight attendant. The story we now understand is that they wanted to do 9/11 15 years early. I said to him, please don't hurt me. My brother died in the mountains. My parents have no one else. In the gunfire, they killed 20 people. It was incredibly bloody in comparison to any hijack that there had ever been before. People have said to me, how was it to speak to the man who spared your life? I said, no, he's not the man who spared my life. He's the man who was going to shoot me and decided not to.
In today's world, there are so many incredible and extraordinary stories of survival. Stories about fighting against the odds, overcoming the toughest situations and never giving up. Stories that need to be told and heard. Stories that can change our perspective on life, offer us empowerment, teach us how to deal with difficulties, and give us inspiration to find inner strength. My name is Enthoven, and you're now listening to They Survived. As our first guest, we have the privilege of hearing from Michael Thexton about his remarkable survival of the Pan Am Flight 73 hijacking in 1986. During 16 terrifying hours, this hijacking resulted in 22 deaths, which he witnessed while being held himself at gunpoint by one of the terrorists. Somehow he is spared and manages to narrowly escape. 36 years later, he confronts the terrorists who held him and is stunned to learn why his life was spared. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
So your story is incredible. Tell me a little bit more about yourself and the context before everything happened.
I live in London and this story happened a long time ago, in 1986. I was 27 and I went on a mountaineering expedition to Pakistan. The reason for the expedition was my older brother, Peter. He was a mountaineer and a doctor, and he did a lot of mountaineering and a bit of doctoring in between. And he died on a mountaineering expedition in northern Pakistan in 1983. He suffered from altitude sickness, which possibly, if he hadn't been the doctor, he might have been able to treat in one of the other mountaineers. But he's buried up a mountain, very high up on a mountain called Broad Peak, 24,000 feet. After he died, I wanted to go to the place, and this was a sort of nice, safe daydream. I'm not a mountaineer. I don't go to places like that. My brother did all the exciting stuff. But at the beginning of 1986, some students from the medical school where he trained as a doctor, they said they were going to hold an expedition in his honor to the area. They were going to try and climb the last mountain that he successfully got up. And would I like to go? Would I like to go as the base camp manager of this expedition? And so I had to face up to the fact that I could only say yes, because I wanted to go and see the place and say goodbye. So I spent a couple of months doing things that I regarded as very, very dangerous, which were, the walk-in is physically tremendously hard. It goes to K2 base camp. It's the same place as Broad Peak. And I had spent 2 months eating not very much and doing a lot of exercise and being very frightened. I got back to the first civilized point on the way home to find a letter waiting saying that they were expecting me to be at work the next week. And I worked out that the flight that we had would not get me there in time, so I rearranged my flight. I left everybody behind and went to catch a flight called Pan Am 73.
To go back to your work, yeah.
To go back to my work. That's right. In fact, we were a very cheapskate expedition. We basically decided that we would buy the food that the porters ate. And by the time we realized that that was completely inadequate for Westerners, we were a long way from a shop. So I had lost off what I currently weigh, probably about 15 or 16 kilos. I looked like a complete wreck. Was it a beautiful trip in honor of your brother? It was a beautiful trip. I mean, it was very moving. I went to this place where my brother died, and it was still quite fresh in my mind. Now now he's my younger brother. He was 30 when he died, and now I'm 63, and no, I'm 64 actually.
How old were you at this?
And I was 27 then, and it was just 3 years before that he had died. In England, we climb hills, and you look sort of there, you look up a bit, and then you go to somewhere like the Alps and you're looking up more steeply, and in the Himalayas you get a crick in the neck. You're looking way up there, you
So
can't
high,
believe how tall they are.
And K2 is one of the
and K2, yes. I mean, I stood at the bottom of K2 and looked up at it, no, it wasn't the mountain where my brother died. That's a next door mountain, Broad Peak, but it's still extraordinarily high and extraordinarily beautiful and rugged and remote and hard work getting about.
So you left to go back to work?
Yeah, so I caught an internal flight. I said goodbye to the expedition. That was a strange thing because, you live in each other's pockets. The 10 people that I was walking with, trekking with, camping with, I wasn't, although I was officially the base camp manager, I was really the mascot. I was there because my name is Thexton, and it was the Pete Thexton Memorial Expedition. So I had to then get myself from Islamabad in the north of Pakistan to Karachi, and then get myself to the airport to catch a plane home. And that was very strange to be sort of cut loose from everything else. The whole thing was peculiar. And going home after what had been a very emotional expedition, I managed to get to the airport and check in. And I mean, I looked very odd because I was so keen to get home. The only ticket I could find was actually a business class ticket. And I had spent probably more than the whole expedition spent on food for 2 months. On
you
this
really
ticket
needed
to
to
get,
go
I
home.
was desperate to get home. I was desperate to get a good meal, see my family.
Yes, I understand.
And so I looked very strange in the business class departure lounge. I was wearing a red duvet jacket. I had mountaineering boots on, a pair of sort of combat style trousers. I also had too much luggage. We had a lot of gear. I had a big bag with the expedition's film in. Now, I mean, you can't believe these days that would be 15 kilos of little cassettes of Super 8 cine film. I was sitting there in the airport departure lounge reading the first news I had seen for the intervening time. And I looked in this Time magazine, and it was, I mean, it's that long ago that it was all about the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the impending collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the year that Chernobyl nuclear power station blew up. It was quite interesting news. But in Pakistan, the daughter of the former prime minister, a man called Ali Bhutto, he had been executed following a military coup, and she had been in exile, and she had come back to the country, and Time magazine was saying, well, maybe there will be trouble. And I can remember sitting there in this departure lounge reading this article and thinking, oh, well, as long as there's no trouble in the airport in the next half hour, I'll be fine, because I've been to the mountain, I've said goodbye to my brother, there's no reason to come back. So I was a very relaxed frame of mind boarding this plane. Then things started to go wrong. I mean, we got taken out to the plane on little buses. It was a beautiful day, sunny, and I walked up the front steps of the plane. A young Indian woman in Pan Am uniform directed me to a seat a few rows back from that front door. And I put this big bag on the seat and opened it to get a book out. And I heard a noise in the second doorway, the one where the economy class passenger was coming in. And I looked up, and there was a man struggling with a flight attendant. And this is a sort of completely shocking thing. You just don't expect to see that.
They're like fighting, or? So
he had his arm around her neck. They were both facing me, and he had a little round glasses and a little moustache, and his arm around her neck. She had the intercom phone in her hand, and they were struggling, and he had a pistol in the hand, that was round her neck. I just stared at him. It's one of those things. You think you would do something. You think you would either run away, or you would duck, or go to help and do something heroic. But I just stared at him, completely dumbstruck. There's a man with a gun. And then a moment later, while I was still gawping at him, there was a noise in the front door, which I'd just come in by, and there was a man in uniform. So this was, I had walked past security guards at the bottom of the steps, who had rifles. This was a man in uniform with a rifle, and he was saying, "Get down, get down." So I sort of tried to sit down on top of this big bag on my seat, thinking that he was on my side.
Because he was wearing a
uniform. And thinking that he's probably going to have a shot at the guy in the second doorway, and I'm very much in the way. And then it all became more peculiar because he was shouting at the flight attendant who'd just shown me the seat and saying, close the door, and she didn't do it. Now, I was thinking that this might be a Pakistani problem. You know, I'd read this article about Benazir Bhutto. I thought maybe there's the man in the second doorway is a Pakistani. This is a security guard. Maybe he's getting her to close the door because there's a problem outside. I think there's a great temptation to tell yourself a good story. Nobody's going to stop and tell you what's going on. So you think, let's make this a Pakistani problem. Let's make it outside the plane, you know, and there's just one guy on the plane. We're all right. But then because she wouldn't close the door, he threatened her with the gun. And that didn't seem right. So she reached out, closed the door. And some point around now, somebody said, this is a hijack. And then I realized this is not somebody else's problem, this is my problem. They didn't know how a jumbo jet is laid out. And this is completely extraordinary. If you see too many films, you expect terrorists to be highly trained, highly intelligent commandos. I mean, the sad fact is that the person with the Kalashnikov who's going to run up the steps of a plane probably doesn't know what's going on any more than me. Somebody up the line has decided to cause pain to America. And in this case, it was Colonel Gaddafi who had paid Abu Nidal to do something. So this guy has arrived in the country and they'd come up with a plan to disguise themselves as security guards, to buy a vehicle or obtain a vehicle, put a flashing light on it so it looked like a security guard's vehicle. They had managed to drive in through the perimeter fence of the airport, and they just drove up to the plane and ran up the steps.
With how many were they?
So there were just four of them. There was a fifth man who was slightly more intelligent in that he didn't try and get on the plane. He was their boss, their immediate boss. So four men had managed to get onto the airport. They bypassed all the security that I'd been through. I'd been rigorously searched.
With all their guns and
they had guns, they had hand grenades, and they simply ran up the steps. And they brushed past armed guards who were standing at the bottom of the steps. Again, I've never had to stand guard duty. It must be one of the world's most boring jobs, except when it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is these men probably have stood at the bottom of the steps of an aircraft in that airport every day for 5 years and nothing has ever happened. And then this day it happens and they don't react. But once again, the big problem is that they see a vehicle driving towards them, four men jumping out, three of them in uniform, and running towards the plane. If they had challenged them, they would just have been shot, because the thing is, they don't know what's going on, but the terrorists do know what's going on. So had they tried to do anything else, probably they would have just been shot. The terrorists would still have been on the plane.
So at this point, the door is closed. The 5 men were inside. And what happened?
Four men were inside. So, well, the key thing was, because they didn't know how the plane was laid out, this man was shouting to the flight attendant, "Where's the captain? What is up these stairs?" Now, a jumbo jet always has stairs, and the cockpit is upstairs. And they just didn't know that. They must have come on the plane, turned to the right, turned to the left, looking for the cockpit. And there's a lot of first-class seating. And the delay meant that the pilots escaped. The flight attendant in the second doorway had shouted a warning to them. And there's a hatch in the top of the cockpit. And they slid down a rope and ran away. So by the time the leader had got to the cockpit, there was nobody in it. And instead of what he wanted to do, fly somewhere else, we were stuck on the ground in Karachi. And
because the plane was flying and maybe...
The plane was supposed to go to Frankfurt and then go to New York. The story we now understand is that they wanted to do 9/11 15 years early, that they wanted to fly this plane over Israel and blow it up or crash it into something. We didn't know that for sure until quite recently.
So there was no pilot, thank God.
no pilot, thank God. I mean, people didn't really know that at that time, that was a good thing. So, I mean, what has happened is that you have taken out of this situation 3 white middle-aged American men in uniform, the enemy. By coincidence, the previous year, Pan Am had decided to recruit local cabin crew to fly planes from India to Europe. And what you had was they put up a job advert in Mumbai and said, who wants to be a Pan Am flight attendant? And they had queues around the block. They selected the best, the most beautiful, the most intelligent. They had an incredibly high caliber cabin crew, but also incredibly inexperienced. And they were dedicated and brave and brilliant. And they weren't the enemy. They were Indians. So these terrorists, they thought that they were going to get on an American plane and it would be full of Americans, and it patently wasn't. So they then were pushed back from their original idea, which was just to take off and go somewhere else and do what they wanted to do. And now they had to negotiate to try to get a pilot. The immediate thing was the leader came back down the stairs and he said, everybody up, everybody back, go back down the plane. So I put my hands in the air and went back down the plane. And I found an empty seat on the aisle and sat with my hands in the air. It was very quiet. I mean, one of the strange things about it was that the music, which they used to play, I don't think they do anymore, but when you were going to take off, there'd be a music in the background.
Yes.
And it's on an endless loop. And it just went on and on all day. So we are sitting with our hands in the air, and the entertainer is playing in the background. Da, 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 da. And it was quite surreal. But everybody was very calm. A lot of the people there were Indians and Pakistanis flying to Europe and flying to America. And they knew that these men were not speaking an Indian or a Pakistani language. They knew they were Arabs. And I think a lot of them formed the opinion, this is not our problem. This is the Western's problem. These people are Arab terrorists, and they will be after the Westerners. Sitting with my hands in the air, feeling very frightened, trying to get control of myself, I thought, people get off hijacks. I mean, in the 1980s, hijacking was not so rare. I mean, you didn't expect it to happen, but you knew about it. And I was thinking back, I was thinking, well, probably somebody will die today, but it doesn't have to be me. I should make myself inconspicuous. I should do what I'm told, and I'll go home. That's and I'm trying to calm myself down. I mean, one of the sad things I'm not particularly proud of, I have to say, looking to my left, the 2 people sitting between me and the window, they looked like Americans. They looked possibly Jewish. And on the floor, there's a Pakistani man who's whispering to his daughter, his teenage daughter. He said, it will be all right, inshallah, God willing. I thought, yes, God willing, it will be all right. But he's looking up at me, the Westerner in the aisle seat, and he's thinking, he's in front of us.
Thinking the same as you.
And I think everybody is looking around. And the 2 Americans, they couldn't see anybody. They just looked sick. It's the most uncomfortable feeling to think that you're in front.
And what happened? They took people.
So the situation didn't change. We gradually became aware that there must not be a pilot because we weren't taking off. We weren't hearing the voice of the pilot on the intercom. There were announcements made by flight attendants who obviously were told what to say. And the flight attendants were so professional. Everything began, ladies and gentlemen. The very first announcement that they made to us was, ladies and gentlemen, the group responsible apologize for the inconvenience caused. I mean, it was surreal. Their argument is not with you. They do not wish to hurt anyone. But if you make any sudden movement, you will be shot. And we got this message, And the great thing is the calm tone meant that we could sort of be calm and think, okay, I won't make a sudden movement. I won't be shot. Whereas if they tried to sort of cheer us up, as the pilot might have done, maybe we'd all have got hopeful and then we'd have been disappointed. So they kept us very even through the day. But we were allowed eventually to lower our hands onto our heads and then into our laps. And in that situation, probably about 2.5, 3 hours into the hijack, just been sitting there. Nothing has happened. I felt quite safe. I was down in the seat, making myself as small as possible. And the leader came down the aisle and he took somebody out of an aisle seat, just said, come with me.
Randomly?
Well, it was
randomly?
fairly random. Apparently, he asked two people, are you American? And they said, no. You American? No. And he just took the next person, who happened, in fact, to have just got his American green card. But he was a Southern Indian man. He was not a man that you would say, oh, there's an American. And he took him to the front of the plane and knelt him in the doorway and negotiated over him for half an hour. And then he shot him and he threw him out of the plane because he wasn't getting his way. And this was, brutal and cold-blooded. And the next thing was an announcement, ladies and gentlemen, will you please hold up your passports and they will be collected. Now, obviously, he's looking for Americans, he's looking for Westerners. I have a British passport in my pocket. The sensible thing, of course, is not to hand in your passport, because if you don't, then they're just not going to see you at all. You have become invisible. They've got a big pile of passports. But I thought, I must do what I'm told. I was completely under control. I must do what I'm told. If they were to search me later and find my passport in my pocket, I'd be in real trouble. They can't search. There are 380 people on this plane. They can't work out that 360 people have found in the passport. Who are the 20 who haven't? So I took it out of my pocket and held it up. The Pakistani man grabbed it out of my hand and handed it to the flight attendant who was going down the line with a bag. He's obviously thought, yeah, British one, get that in the bag. He's in front of us. And there was an announcement that if your passport was in the overhead lockers in your hand luggage, you shouldn't get out of your seat. These two Americans just sort of groaned with relief because it was a reason not to hand in a passport. The flight attendant came by. There was a further announcement saying, Sunshine, come back with what you got. But she carried on down the plane. So Sunshine is an extraordinary woman. I have the great privilege of having met her several times since. But on that day, she could not have been in any way criticized for just doing what she was told, collecting the passports. But she had seen Rajesh Kumar shot, this first man, and she thought he's going to kill an American if I put an American passport in the bag. And she decided she would not do that, which is just incredibly brave. But then to add to that, she thought, actually, he's not going to believe it's a Pan Am plane. If there are no American passports in this bag, he's going to know what I've done. And so she put in the bag American passports with brown faces and Pakistani and Indian names. And she was determined that she would explain to him that these people, they're really Indians and Pakistanis. They just happen to have an American passport. Mm-hmm. And so any passport with a white face, she dropped it, discarded it.
That's incredible.
Quite extraordinary. Went back to the front of the plane. As she expected, the terrorist said, give me the Americans. So she tipped it all out on the floor, and she and her colleague went through the pile, and she found 3 more that had been handed to her in a bundle, and she hid them under his nose, under a seat. And that is just extraordinary. And unfortunately, of course, it meant that the next announcement was, ladies and gentlemen, will Mr. Michael John please come to the front of the plane, which are my first 2 names. I sat there thinking, why? There can't be somebody else called Michael John on this plane. I had a moment before they actually read out my full name to think, how are the British first? Where are the Americans? What's going on? And I tried again to tell myself a good story. I thought maybe my parents have got through some message about my brother having died, and I'm being let off the plane. No, they're going to shoot me. I just could not understand or believe it. My parents don't even know that I'm on this plane. And I thought for a moment, should I just sit here? But no, now they're looking for me. They're going to come and find me. My passport photo was clean shaven, and I had quite a substantial beard and long hair and so on. But they would find me. So I had to go, and I stood up with what might well have been my last words, which were, "For fuck's sake!" I've always thought that my mother might have said, did he have some final message for us? And that would have been it. And I stepped over the people in the aisle, presented myself to a terrorist who was standing in the doorway between economy and business. I said, that's me. He waved me through. And I walked forward, and there were 4 flight attendants sitting in the 4 seats just behind that front door. And there was the leader, who had now stripped to the waist. He's probably, I don't know, 190 centimeters tall, something like that. Big man, muscular, had this rifle with, it was a Kalashnikov, I now know. I didn't know anything at that time. But he had 2 magazines strapped together with sticky tape. And he had my passport in his hand. He said, "You are Michael John Thexton?" Because I don't look like the passport photo. And I mean, it's sort of, he was checking the right person had come forward, which is bizarre. And I said, "Yes, that's me." And he said, what are these? And pointed, I still had round my neck cine cameras that I'd been taking the film. So I said, "They're cameras," and they got taken off, put aside. And he said, "Are you a soldier?" And I said, no, I'm a teacher. Now, I was telling a friend of mine this the following week, and he said, there really is no circumstance in which you would admit that you're a chartered accountant, which is what I actually am. But I thought that wasn't a very sort of, that sounded too capitalist, imperialist. So I said I was a teacher. And he then looked me in the eye and he said, "Do you have a gun?" I burst out laughing. I mean, I probably was about to dissolve into uncontrollable hysterics anyway, out of panic. But I mean, this was just the silliest question. I said, "I haven't got a gun. You've got all the guns around here." And then he said, "Kneel here." And he put his hand on my shoulder and made me kneel in the doorway. The 4 flight attendants, they were in floods of tears. They had seen this happen before. I mean, because I was feeling so safe, I hadn't even seen him take this other man. I was not aware that somebody had already been shot. So I thought it was the first, but I sort of knew what was going to happen. But the flight attendants absolutely knew what was going to happen because they had seen it. And I said to him, "Please don't hurt me. My brother died in the mountains. My parents have no one else." And he waved a hand as if to say, "I haven't got time for that. I'm busy." And I knelt there and I thought, this is it. He stood, one of the flight attendants, in the doorway with a megaphone, and she spoke to somebody down on the under the plane. He said to her, "Tell him that if anyone comes near the plane, if any US troops come near the plane, we will kill one body immediately," which is obviously me. "Tell him I have bombers on board and all of my men are commandos." And the man below came back with a message that immediately saved my life. He said, "Tell him that there's no need to hurt anybody. There is a member of the Pan Am ground crew on board who can operate the cockpit radio. Talk to us on the cockpit radio. We will withdraw everybody from around the plane." And so they made an announcement for a member of the Pan Am ground crew who'd been caught on board the plane, which he was preparing for takeoff. This man came forward, went upstairs, and another man came and stood guard over me. And I was left there kneeling behind this door, which was now closed, with the 4 flight attendants and a big pile of passports on the floor, in which I could see there were no American passports. It was just a sort of one of those things. There was another British one on the top, and I was looking at it thinking, why haven't they picked him? But here I am.
What happened after?
So I had to go from thinking it doesn't have to be me to somebody will die today. It's obviously going to be me. I still can't think of any possible way in which I get out of this. And so I decided I had to say goodbye. And so I whispered to one of the flight attendants, "Please tell my family I love them very much." She just sort of said, "Shh, don't worry, it's all right." I felt better for having possibly got that message out. And obviously there is the famous film about 9/11, Flight 93, in which that is the sort of the key moment that they're told to use their mobile phones and say goodbye to their loved ones. And I've never been able to watch it. I mean, not least because it's it's a pretty traumatic thing anyway. But that moment is the thing that I would feel so much that's what you would want to do more than anything else, is be able to say goodbye. I felt then that I would say goodbye to everyone else. And so in my head, I went round and said goodbye to my friends. And I don't know how I would do that today. I now have a wife and I have children, and it would tear you apart. I think that's, almost the worst thing for any hostage is the thought that you will never be able to say goodbye. I got round to some people who I'd not got on with well on the expedition, and I thought about, there's an old saying, I think it comes from the Bible, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Put it to rest. And I thought about that, and I thought, I hope that they will remember me for the better times we had. And eventually that got me round to thinking about the terrorists. And I thought, I think the sun and anger applies to them as well. I don't want to die angry with them. I don't want to die frightened of them. And I determined that I would forgive them. And this was a very strange thing. I mean, I think it's a product, there's a certain type of British movie and British story, a very old-fashioned sort of British heroes, not necessarily the modern day type of hero, but the old expression, the stiff upper lip. If the guy had come down the stairs and said, I'm going to shoot you now, I determined that I was going to say, all right, make a clean job of it. You have your reasons. I don't agree with them, but I forgive you. And after I had decided that, he didn't frighten me. The leader didn't frighten me. I was absolutely certain he was going to shoot me, but he looked quite professional. I thought he would shoot me and I would be dead and that would be it. I was frightened of the second man because he was younger, he was jumpy, he was aggressive, and I thought he might just shoot me in the leg just for fun. And that would be painful. And so he was scary. But I was able then just to sit and wait. The strange thing about this hijack, about probably, most sieges, is a lot of it is a long period of absolutely nothing happening. And so I sat there at the front of the plane for 12 hours or so, during which I had probably 4 or 5 conversations with somebody. Nothing much happened. 1 or 2 surprising things happened. So at the one point where the leader was on a break from the negotiations which were happening upstairs on the radio, he was sitting with the 4 flight attendants around him in those seats, and another man came up the plane. It was the man I'd seen at the beginning, who was dressed as a Pakistani, and he had a hand grenade in his hand, and he was chain smoking, and he had the pin of the hand grenade around his finger that was holding the cigarette. And so he's just holding this hand grenade with his thumb on the lever. So basically he was showing everybody this to demonstrate to them that if they tried anything on with him, he would drop it. We would all be dead. He came up the aisle, and he was perhaps a more severe Muslim than the leader. The leader was flirting with the flight attendants, and they were doing their best to try to be charming back to him, while being pretty disgusted by the whole thing. So this man came and he sort of looked, he didn't say a word, he just looked rather disapproving. He showed me the hand grenade. I'm still on the floor, so he leaned down and showed me his thumb on the lever of his hand grenade. Okay. And he turned around and went back and went into the toilet. And I thought, what's he going to do with the hand grenade? But a moment later, there was a blaring siren, and the leader jumped up with his gun. He said, what is happening? What is happening? And he could easily have just opened fire at a shadow, and then it would have been mayhem. And one of the flight attendants said, don't worry, he's smoking in the toilet. It's the fire alarm.
Oh,
and she walked back. She walked back and she opened the door and she averted her eyes and said, terribly sorry. Apparently he was sitting on the toilet pointing a gun at her head. And she turned off the fire alarm and came back, and we all sort of went back to the chat that we were having. It was funny, but I mean, it could have been absolutely catastrophic. At other points in the day, I had a very brief conversation with the leader. The flight attendants were allowed to go down the plane and serve coffee and sandwiches to the rest of the passengers. And so there was just me and the leader. And he said to me, he said, are you married? I said, no, I'm not married. I have a girlfriend. And he said, I'm sorry. I don't like this fighting, this killing. I would like to go out with women, go out dancing, go out drinking. But the Americans and Israelis have stolen my country. And without my country, these things are no good. And so I said, oh, so you're Palestinian then? Up to that point, I had not been absolutely sure. And he said, yes, Palestinian. And that was all we said. I have to be very careful about what I say about this, but I felt sorry for him, not because I felt that he had any sort of justification for what he was doing, but I felt sorry that he thought that it would help when it would not help. Mm-hmm. That he was doing a thing that was terribly wrong, would make everything worse. but he thought that he was doing it for a good reason. Now, of course, he may only have been saying that. He may have liked murder and mayhem, in fact, but him saying that, I just felt so sad that this was what he felt he had to do. The young aggressive one, I mean, I was lying on the floor half asleep, and I overheard him haranguing the flight attendants saying, "I hate rich people. Rich people kill our children. I hate the Americans. I hate the British. I hate the French. I hate the Spanish." And I lay there thinking, he's never met anybody Spanish. You know, I mean, he's just been told all his life that these people are the reason you have a miserable life. And I thought, again, how sad. You know, who is there to tell him that it is not so, or that it could be otherwise? And of course, I mean, it took me several years to realize that they were having a very bad day. You know, they had taken over this plane expecting to fly somewhere, hasn't got a pilot. The people in uniform are not Americans. Most of the passengers are not Americans. They collect in the passports, and all of the American passports are Indians and Pakistanis. They select a Brit, and they get somebody who looks worse fed than any of them. You know, I looked like a refugee, I really did. And they haven't managed to find the enemy on this jumbo jet. And I always, you know, I wondered, well, maybe if I had been wearing a suit and said that I was a chartered accountant rather than a teacher, maybe they would have shot me. But that was, maybe it's proof of the existence of God. You know, God said, let them pick Thexton, they won't shoot him. It was a strange coincidence. But in the end, once again, I was half asleep on the floor, and it was now about 9 o'clock in the evening. And I was woken up by the young one kicking my feet, and he said, up, move. And I picked myself up and stumbled back down the aisle again, and it was darker and hotter. And I tried to work out what was going on. And what was going on was that the plane had been sitting on the ground for 15 hours. The ground power unit that powers the electrics is not supposed to run for that time. So it had either run out of fuel or it had seized up or something. And the plane was going onto its batteries and all the electrics were failing. So the music had stopped, the air conditioning had stopped, and the lights were blinking and dimming. And I got back into the main cabin. I saw a different seat, a window seat this time, not far in front of the wing exit. And I went and sat in it. And I thought, this is extraordinary. I stand the chance. I'm back with the others. But you could tell that something was going to happen. It was very, very tense. The plane got completely dark. And what I remember is just bang. And I thought, is that a hand grenade? But a moment later, there was automatic gunfire, bang, 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 from the front of the plane, and then bang, 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 from the back of the plane. Somebody at the back firing a Kalashnikov such a long way away in this big jumbo jet. And then the man at the front had changed his magazines and let fly with another magazine, just firing indiscriminately into the passengers. What I remember is it not being loud. Now, I'm told that people were shouting and screaming, but it had been so loud. And then it was not loud. And I lifted myself up enough to see on the far side of the plane, in the darkness, there was a different color of dark, and it was the shape of a door. And I thought, somebody's got a door open. We've got to go. Put my hands on the man next to me in the dark, and I said, come on, let's get out of here. And so he went towards that door. I saw the one behind me was also open. Apparently a lot of people got out onto the starboard wing. I was possibly the only person who got out onto the port wing for whatever reason. It was in darkness because all the buildings with the lights on were the other side of the plane. So it was very dark and there was no chute. And so I had this idea, I will slide off the back of the wing and I will dangle from my fingertips and drop what I thought would be a couple of, a meter or two to the ground. And it is like jumping off the roof of a 2 or 3 story building. I mean, it's a long way down. So I slid off the back of the wing. There's nothing to hold on to. I just went at some speed. But I was light and fit, and I was wearing my mountaineering boots. And there were lots of people who jumped off the other wing and hurt themselves quite badly. I landed in a heap, picked myself up, and ran away.
As fast as you can.
As fast. Well, I was doing a sort of zigzagging run, as if I was in the D-Day landings or something, because I thought that's what you should do. Nobody was anywhere near me at all. And that was it, really. I mean, there was still quite a story about getting home.
But what happened with the people who stayed in the...
So
airplane?
So in the plane, in the gunfire, they killed 20 people. More than 100 people were injured, some of them jumping off the wings, some of them by grenade blasts, some of them by gunfire. I mean, it was mayhem. There were 380 people on the plane, and you know, at least a third of them had a physical injury or were killed. It was incredibly bloody, you know, in comparison to any hijack that there had ever been before.
But why was there not a pilot able? Because they were looking for a pilot every.
Well, they were looking for a pilot, but the Pan Am station chief, a man called Viraf Doroga, who was actually the man who'd done the negotiating on the megaphone to save me, he had been on a course, amazingly, in the previous 2 weeks run by Pan Am, and he knew that the most important thing was to keep it on the ground. They were not going to get a pilot because Viraf Doroga was not going to give them one. He knew that however bad it was on the ground, it would be worse if this plane could fly somewhere else. He didn't know. We had no inkling that they were going to blow up the plane, but it obviously would have been worse. The thing that was bad was that the Pakistani authorities were told by Viraf Doroga that the ground power unit would fail, and they didn't produce backup electricity or backup lighting or whatever. The thing that was perfectly proper was that they were practicing for a storming. They had a bunch of commandos on a different jumbo jet in a different part of the airport. When they heard the shooting, they all piled into lorries and arrived 15 minutes after it had all finished, which to me was a good thing. I wouldn't have wanted to sort of try and get off the plane with a bunch of commandos coming the other way. They afterwards, immediately afterwards, the Pakistani authorities said, our commandos stormed the plane and rescued the passengers.
Oh my God, yeah, that doesn't.
And this is a lie that has reappeared again and again over the years. I mean, it's actually a lie that matters because the terrorists in their trial in Pakistan, they used that as their defense. They said, we didn't shoot anybody. It was the Pakistani commandos. Anybody who was there would know that the commandos were not on the plane. The thing that was worst was that although they were planning to storm the plane 4 hours later, perhaps, they had no plan for what to do with the passengers. They hadn't got the hospitals ready, and there were people who died who didn't need to die. So there was mayhem in the airport afterwards. And I got back to the terminal building, and I met Sunshine, who had spent all day looking at me and thinking I'll put him in the front of the queue. And she was very relieved to see me alive. The thing about that story, the next day, I made a promise. I thought to myself, I've been so lucky to get off this. If I can ever do anything to help anybody in the same circumstance, I must do it, without question. When I got home, I found that there are all sorts of people who have a professional interest in understanding what's going on in this sort of situation. So in particular, police negotiators, people who stand outside a siege with a megaphone and try to get everybody out, and commandos and cabin crew and all of these people. So I have spent more than 37 years doing courses, telling this story to all these people. So it has become part of my life to tell this story. And one or two sort of incidents on that way. In 2001, the leader was released by the Pakistanis. He had been picked up on the plane. They arrested the 4 men. They put them on trial. They sentenced them to death, and that was commuted to life.
They were on death row.
They were on death row, but I think that they weren't going to be executed by Pakistan. But in 2001, in September of 2001, they released the leader and deported him. And I'm fairly sure that there would have been a quiet agreement between the Pakistani government, which was quite friendly with America at that time, and the American government, that they would deport him to a place where the Americans could get him. Because it was just after 9/11.
Yeah.
And it was not a good time for a man who had hijacked an American plane to be at large in the world. So the Americans grabbed him. And they took him to America. They put him on trial. And so in May of 2004, I went to an American courtroom in Washington, D.C. with probably, 30 other people who'd been on the plane and other people who had lost loved ones on the plane and so on. And we sat and watched him sentenced. And the judge in that case, he had said to the prosecutors, he said, the guy's taking a plea bargain. The Justice Department will not insist on the death penalty. He will accept a guilty plea, but I don't want this to be a quiet deal between the Justice Department and the perpetrator. I want to hear from the people who were affected. And so 25 people, including me, including Sunshine, including various other people, sat in the witness box in this federal court, and we told the story. And it was raw. And there were people who had never told it before at all. And it was harrowing. I guess for some people it was cathartic. People said that they were looking for closure. Now, I have to say that I think there were 4 of us out of the 21 who spoke who didn't want the death penalty. Me. I said on the day, I forgave him, just for me, not for anybody else, because that's not my business. But having forgiven him on the day, I can't sort of unforgive him. I can't bring myself to say that he should die. But also, if you execute him, it will make things worse. It will be a recruiting call, and more people will die. Mm-hmm. So I tried to make that point. But I was very much in the minority. But it seemed to me that the people who said the same as me were more at peace than the people who said they were looking for closure. I felt if you need him to be executed to get closure, you won't get closure. It will never, nothing could make it right. Mm-hmm. Nothing can bring back the dead.
I understand.
Yeah. So he was sentenced to 160 years in an American jail. And after I'd been to that trial, I decided I knew enough to sort of write a book about it. And somebody read the book and said, I think that it would be really good if we had a television program where you interview him in the jail. So that was a rather extraordinary idea, which I was, and I thought about that, and I thought, obviously that is really out there. But in the courtroom, he said that he was sorry. And I thought, if he could be made to say sorry on television, then maybe somewhere that would put off a young Muslim terrorist who might otherwise decide it was a good idea to blow himself up or take a gun and kill people. And so I went along with the idea. I said, yes, okay, let's sort of investigate this. Now, I wrote him a letter in his jail in Florence, Colorado, and he wrote back. And we had this sort of slightly strange correspondence. The governor of the prison said it would not be conducive to the good order of his prison to have a television crew there, and it wasn't going to happen. But we just wrote some letters to each other. And the weird thing is, we didn't talk about hijacking. We talked about football. It was just the sort of conversation you would have with any old person in a pub. But he is a murderer of 20 people, But he's just an ordinary, misguided man. The beginning of the first lockdown, this was a sort of very strange thing. I got an email saying, we're going to make a documentary about the hijack, and would you be interested in taking part? And I thought, well, yes, because this is now a very important story to me. I'd have to be part of it in order to make sure they tell it properly. Mm-hmm. And we had interviews, and they said, we've been to America, we've seen Sunshine, we've seen all these various other people. And then they came back for a last bit of filming at my house. They said, we'd like to just have a little discussion, see some mementos, see those letters that you wrote to Safarini in the jail. Leading up to that, the director came to see me. He said, I want to just talk to you about a few details. And I said, well, we're talking. And he said, no, I want to see you to talk about it. And so when he came, I realized why he wanted to sit and look at me while he was saying. He said, I've been in touch with Safarini in the jail, and we don't want to give him a voice. We don't want him to be part of this. But he said that he would talk to you if you would talk to him. He said, up to you, no pressure. But if you want to ask him questions, he said he would answer them. And I thought about this for quite a while. And then I decided, once again, I would have to. It was a bit like going to the mountain to see where my brother died. You couldn't turn that down. there were questions that I wanted to ask him. And so it was that I was just standing in my kitchen at home with the director's phone in my hand, waiting for the call to come in because he had to ring us. And the phone went, and he said, it's Zaid. And I said, well, it's Mike here. And he said, Mike, my friend, it's good to hear your voice. You know, it's completely weird thing. And I didn't know how long we got. So I said, Zaid, you know, Ben tells me that that you're willing to answer questions. He said, yes, ask anything you like. And so the first question, which I had discussed with the director, but it was the thing that I wanted to know, I said, I've always wondered why you put me back with the others, that if you were going to shoot people, why didn't you just shoot me? Why did you put me back with the others? And the answer that he gave was, it had not occurred to me in all these years. He said, oh, it was what you said about your brother. He died in the mountains or something. He said, it touched my heart. I thought, just sit aside, man. And I mean, I had to carry on the rest of the conversation. I had some more questions, but I was just astonished because when I told him about my brother, it was right at, you know, when I'd just been called forward, he'd said, I'm too busy. And it didn't occur to me that he was even listening, that he remembered it 12 hours later when he put me back with the others, or that he would remember it 36 years later when we were talking on the phone. It was the most extraordinary thing. Obviously, I mean, it was a big thing in this documentary film. It became a story about my brother. It was my brother's memorial. Obviously, also lots of other people on the plane, but the story of my brother sort of saving my life was quite a thing. I mean, the other thing, I asked him questions which I had always wanted to know. I said, why did you open fire? And I got what I thought was the first honest answer that he's ever given, which was, we panicked. Because he's always previously said, we didn't open fire. It was the Pakistani commandos. We just panicked. And he confirmed that this was a suicide mission and they were going to crash the plane. And so I found out some quite meaty things in that phone call. It was extraordinary.
Was he afraid that it was like a suicide?
He said that he had become convinced that his organization, the Abu Nidal organization, was a brutal, mercenary, terrorist organization, and they would execute people who they thought had done something bad. And one of his best friends had been executed in front of him very shortly before, and he thought he was next. And he said it was to accept this suicide mission was what he thought he had to do to get out of the organization. You know, to which I could have said, well, you could have done other things that didn't involve killing 380 people, but I didn't say that.
And how did you hang up? Like, you ever spoke to him after?
I haven't spoken to him since. I wanted to write him another letter, but the problem is I don't want him in my life, you know.
Yes.
He says I'm his old friend, and he's not. And people ask, you know, people have said to me, you know, how was it to speak to the man who spared your life? I said, no, he's not the man who spared my life. He's the man who was going to shoot me and decided not to. You know,
that's a better way to say it. Yeah.
And so I thought I can't really send this letter without in some way inviting him in that, you know, I at the very simplest level, I'd be putting my address on the envelope. And I don't want him to know that. And my wife doesn't want him to know that.
I totally understand. Yeah.
You know, it's, I don't think he's coming after me. You know, I don't think that there is any comeback. He does have parole hearings, but the Justice Department turn up regularly and they say he's sentenced to 160 years for a reason.
Every hijacker is still in prison.
No, the other 4 were quietly released later by Pakistan at a time when Pakistan was less friendly than with America, and they have left. And nobody, well, I say nobody knows where they are. The Justice Department still have a price on their heads and still doesn't give up looking for them. And that was one of the questions I asked him. I said, do you know where your friends are? And he said, oh, yes, they're in the Lebanon. I talk to them all the time on the telephone.
That's crazy.
And I thought that was a surprising question, a surprising answer. And I suspect that the Americans know pretty closely where they are, but it is not worth risking somebody's life risking a diplomatic incident to go and get them. But I should think that if they ever poke their nose out of the Lebanon and put themselves in the way, in international space, I think they will find that they have been collared.
How was it for you seeing 9/11 happening?
9/11 was it was a terrible thing.
Yes.
And, you know, people said, oh, you must have felt it particularly. I mean, I don't think I felt it particularly. Everybody felt that it was a terrible thing. I mean, there were two reasons, I suppose, that I found particularly affecting. The story of people having to say goodbye to their loved ones on the mobile phones. I just felt that I knew what that was like. And then the fact that that led to them realizing what was happening and trying to take back the plane and probably crashing. The other thing was that my brother-in-law was working as a flight attendant out of Boston on United, and he could so easily have been on the plane that crashed into the Twin Towers, and he knew people who were on that plane. And so on that day, my wife was desperately trying to find out where he was. A strange thing, I mean, I recently have been on doing another course on talking to cabin crew or people who train cabin crew. I tell the story, and the idea is that I suppose it makes it more real. The person running the course, he said, well, you know, you say that everything is different after 9/11. You say that the passengers would behave differently, and that's probably true. But 9/11 is ancient history now. You know, that there are a lot of people, certainly people who work in the airlines, cabin crew are often quite young. They don't remember 9/11, or if they do remember it, they remember it dimly as something that happened when they were children. Mm-hmm. These things come and go into the past. Our story is very, very old.
So have you ever been in touch with the other passengers or flight attendants?
Yes, I do. I have got in touch with various of the people over the years. I've been in touch again with Sunshine.
That's beautiful.
One of the things Sunshine, a thing that I realized at the trial, when we went to the trial, I met Sunshine again. I realized what should be obvious is that you can't be that extraordinary, brave, intelligent, amazing person just on one day. You know, that's how she is. And then if fate gives you your day, then you show it. In 2015, an Indian film was released called Nirja, which is about this hijack, and it's very fictionalized, and it takes all of the heroic things that were done and gives them to the flight attendant who died, who was the senior person, Nirja Banout. It's a very unfair portrayal of all of the other flight attendants who don't get their names. You know, it's not sort of literally slanderous, but it's not the truth. You know, and that's a shame. Anyway, as a result, I was in touch with Sunshine again. We were discussing the film, and she said, I'm coming to Vienna with my family on tour around Europe. You will meet me. And so I said, yes, of course I will. So I went and spent 3 days being a tourist in Vienna as part of Sunshine's family, and that was extraordinary as well. So it's a strange thing. It's
sort of connection.
A connection for a bad reason. Yeah. But it's good to make that connection.
Yeah. What would you like to say, or maybe as a sort of thing to touch you to our listeners?
You have to do your best. I mean, that is one of the things that I felt afterward. I felt kneeling there on the floor. It did occur to me, I'm fairly sure I know where there are some Americans. I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. It might be that it wouldn't help, but I couldn't live with that. You know? So you have to do your best, and you get off the plane, get out of the bad situation, and then you can look back and think it was okay.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing your story, a powerful testament of not only resilience and renewal, but also forgiveness. And I am reminded of the unwavering spirit that can overcome even the most daunting challenges. Thank you all for listening to They Survived. Let us know what you think of this episode. If you're inspired by this unique and extraordinary survival story, please follow or subscribe to our podcast and check out our social media for more stories like these. Until next time, take care and don't miss the next episode.
in January of 1971 came the day when we set sail. It didn't matter what happened, as long as the Lucette. And then I heard this big noise behind me. I turned my head, and there were 3 killer whales. Bang, bang, bang. The whole boat jarred in the water. And he said, "We are sinking. Abandoned ship." We felt extremely vulnerable out there in that little raft. And my mum said, "I think we should say the Lord's Prayer." I said, "I would rather die here with you than die out there alone. And if I die, you will all die too."